near the German frontier, northwest of Aachen, September 1944. A senior German staff officer, his name appears in a post-war foreign military studies report compiled by U.S. Army historians, described a reconnaissance observation that he said took him several minutes to process. Several days earlier, his division had engaged an American infantry battalion on the western approach to the Siegfried Line. The engagement had been costly for both sides, but by his staff's assessment, the American unit had been broken. Not destroyed outright, but combat ineffective by any standard German formation criteria. Too many dead, too many wounded, too few officers remaining. By German doctrine, by German logistics, by German operational experience accumulated across 4 years of war on 2 fronts, a unit in that condition needed weeks to reconstitute. It needed replacements processed through a regimental depot system. It needed time for new officers to learn their men. It needed time for shattered trust between survivors and new arrivals to be rebuilt. It needed, at minimum, 2 to 3 weeks of rear area consolidation before it could function again as a coherent fighting unit. 3 days later, the same battalion was on the line. Not a different battalion. The same one. Same unit designation. Same regimental markings. Functioning. Attacking. The staff officer wrote, according to the compiled post-war record, that his first assumption was that German intelligence had made an error in unit identification. His second assumption was that the Americans had used a fresh unit under the same designation as a deception. His third assumption, and the one that stayed with him, was that neither of those explanations was actually correct. What he was looking at was the same unit, partially rebuilt, re-equipped, and placed back into the line inside a window of time that his own army could not have achieved under any scenario available to them in 1944. He was right about all of it, and he was still wrong about what it actually meant. If someone in your family served in the European theater and came home talking about the pace of American operations, the sense that the army never seemed to run out of men or material, this is the part of the story that explains why that feeling was real. This is not a story about American courage in 1944. Courage was present. It is not the explanation. This is not a story about American firepower, or about the Sherman tank, or about air superiority, or about any single weapon system that gave U.S. forces an edge in the campaign from Normandy to the Rhine. All of those things mattered. None of them explains what the German staff officer was looking at. This is a story about a machine, a quiet, administrative, unglamorous, paper-heavy, logistically precise machine that no German commander in the European theater ever fully understood until after the war was over, and that most histories of the campaign still treat as background noise. The machine was the American replacement and reconstitution system, the pipeline that took a battalion from combat ineffective to combat ready in days, not weeks. The system that meant German operational planning, which depended on attritional arithmetic, on the assumption that destroying a unit's combat power meant removing it from the equation for a calculable period, was working from a set of assumptions that had stopped being true the moment American forces broke out of Normandy. By late summer 1944, the German army on the Western Front was conducting sophisticated operational thinking against a machine it could not read, could not measure, and had no doctrine for countering. It was planning against the opponent that followed different rules of attrition entirely. The theater was northwestern Europe, autumn and winter of 1944. The American Army, over 1 million men in the European theater of operations, fed by a replacement and supply pipeline running from the United States through the United Kingdom and through the Normandy beaches. The German Army, shorter interior lines, fighting on home territory in the West, and running out of everything the American machine was producing in surplus. The invisible asymmetry between them was not primarily a question of what the two sides were shooting at each other. It was a question of what happened the morning after. The unit's strength return was a piece of paper, a form, a document submitted to higher headquarters on a regular basis, daily in high-tempo operations, otherwise at prescribed intervals, that reported a unit's current effective strength by grade, by specialty, by weapon system, and by equipment status. American units in the European theater generated these forms continuously. So did German units. The difference was what those forms reflected about the two systems behind them. On the American side, the form connected downward to a supply chain that could actually respond to the numbers on the page. A battalion reporting heavy losses in riflemen would trigger a corresponding flow from the replacement system. The form connected upward to a theater-level picture of manpower that allowed the Army service forces to plan replenishment across the entire front simultaneously. The form was not just bureaucratic record-keeping. It was a real-time diagnostic tool for a system capable of acting on what it found. Post-war research into the U.S. Army's replacement operations in the European theater, documented extensively in the official Army history and in studies produced by the Operations Research Office, shows replacement processing times that German staff officers, when they encountered the data after the war, consistently described as implausible against what they knew of their own system's capabilities. In a high-tempo period, a replacement soldier could move from a stateside training division through the transatlantic crossing through the replacement depot, the Reppel-Deppel, as American soldiers called it, with a mixture of resignation and dark humor, and into a frontline unit within 3 to 4 weeks of the decision to accelerate his movement. In forward area reconstitution of a unit that had been hit but not destroyed, the timeline was shorter still. Individual replacements moved from corps-level replacement depots to regimental collection points to battalion within 48 to 72 hours in active operations. Equipment, similarly, moved through ordnance collection, triage, repair, or replacement, and returned to unit on a cycle that German maintenance officers, when they examined American salvage and repair records post-war, described as industrially unprecedented in a field army context. The September encounter west of Aachen, the staff officers' 3-day reconstitution problem, was not exceptional. It was ordinary. It was what the machine did, routinely, quietly, without drama, the way an assembly line does what it does, continuously, at scale, without needing the situation to be special. This is the uncomfortable part, and I think it gets glossed over in most accounts. The American replacement system worked. It processed men and materiel at industrial scale. It kept units functional. But the men who moved through that system, the individual replacements fed into depleted units, experienced something the system's administrators in Washington almost certainly did not think about very much. They were being inserted into units where the social fabric of combat, the trust, the collective memory, the informal knowledge of who was reliable and who wasn't, had been built by other men who were now dead or gone. The machine was efficient. What it did to the individual was something else entirely. The German army was not a poorly organized institution. It was, by most operational measures through the early middle years of the war, the best organized army on earth. Its doctrine was sophisticated. Its officer corps was educated. Its logistical planning, within the constraints it operated under, was competent. Its problem in 1944 was not incompetence. Its problem was that its mental model of how armies absorbed attrition was built from German experience, and German experience was not American experience. The German replacement system operated on a fundamentally different architecture. Replacements were not generated, processed, and delivered through a centralized theater-level pipeline in the same way. German divisions received replacement drafts, but the speed and volume of that flow was governed by factors that had been deteriorating since 1942. Manpower reserves, training capacity, transportation capacity, fuel, and the growing gap between losses on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the rate at which those losses could be offset. By 1944, a German division that had been heavily engaged was typically looking at a reconstitution timeline measured in weeks at minimum, often longer. When a German formation suffered severe officer casualties, the problem compounded. Experienced officers were not available in the numbers required to replace them. At the rate losses were occurring, a German battalion that had been operationally broken was genuinely broken in a way that took time to repair because the system behind it had been stretched to a point where rapid reconstitution was no longer a reliable expectation. German operational planning on the Western Front in the autumn of 1944 applied these assumptions, derived from German experience and, before the breakout, from German observation of other armies, to the American force. When German intelligence assessed that a unit had taken losses sufficient to reduce it to combat-ineffective status, that assessment implicitly included a prediction. The unit would be out of the fight for a calculable period. Operational plans were built around that prediction. Reserve commitments were timed against it. Counterattack windows were scheduled on the assumption that the American unit in question would not be back on the line within 72 hours. The prediction was wrong, systematically, repeatedly, operationally wrong. And the error was not the German staff's fault in the sense of careless analysis. The error was structural. They were running an accurate model of their own army's constraints and applying it to an opponent whose constraints were categorically different. The model was not broken. The assumption that the model applied to the American army was. This kind of institutional mirror reading, assuming the opponent is limited by the same things you are limited by, is one of the most persistent cognitive errors in military planning. In the autumn of 1944, it cost the German army on the Western Front a precision of response it could not afford to lose. Understanding what the German staff officer was looking at requires understanding what the American replacement machine actually was. It was not a single system. It was a chain of interlocking systems, each designed to handle a different phase of the problem, and each designed to move the product, the man, the weapon, the vehicle, the unit, forward faster than the problem of attrition could accumulate. The first link was training. By 1944, the United States had been training soldiers through a standardized Army ground forces system since 1942. The training pipeline produced men with a baseline of infantry, armor, artillery, engineer, and signal skills that could be assigned to specific military occupational specialties and moved directly into the replacement pool. When a theater-level request for additional riflemen arrived at the Army Service Forces, the question was not whether trained men existed. It was how quickly they could be moved from where they were to where they were needed. The second link was the replacement depot system in the European theater itself. The replacement depot, the Reppel-Deppel, was not a comfortable institution. American soldiers who passed through it described it in terms that ranged from impersonal to actively dehumanizing. Men were processed, held, given weapons they had not fired in weeks, and assigned to units they had never met, sometimes within 48 hours of clearing the depot. The system was not designed to make the experience comfortable. It was designed to make the throughput continuous. It succeeded at that. The third link was the corps and divisional replacement structure. Each American division in the European theater maintained a pool of personnel, managed through the division's G1 section, that served as a buffer between the replacement depot and the battalion. When a battalion took losses, it reported those losses on the unit strength return. The report moved up to regimental and divisional level, where it was matched against available replacements in the pool. Movement orders went out. Men moved forward. The system was not seamless. No human system is. But it was designed to close the gap between reported loss and delivered replacement faster than the German system could close a comparable gap. The fourth link, and the one that German observers consistently underestimated when they first examined American logistics records post-war, was the ordnance and equipment replacement chain. The U.S. Army's ordnance system in the European theater operated on a philosophy of recovery, triage, and forward return that treated damaged equipment not as a loss, but as a resource in transit. Disabled vehicles were recovered by ordnance crews operating close to the forward edge of the battle area. They were assessed rapidly at collection points. Category 1, repairable in the field. Category 2, repairable at a general support ordnance company. Category 3, returned to depot for major work or cannibalization. A Sherman tank with track and suspension damage that would have been written off by a German maintenance unit or held behind the front for weeks while parts were located, was typically assessed, triaged, and returned to its unit or replaced with a reconditioned vehicle on a timeline measured in days. The fifth link was the supply chain that kept the whole machine moving. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that ran continuously from the Normandy supply beaches to forward depots through the autumn of 1944, was carrying roughly 12,500 tons of supplies per day at its peak. That number is not primarily interesting as a logistical statistic. It is interesting because of what it meant operationally. It meant that American units in contact with the enemy were, in the logistical sense, not isolated outposts operating at the end of a fragile thread. They were outlets at the forward end of a pipe with enormous pressure behind it. The German army, by contrast, was operating under conditions in which each of these links had been progressively degraded. Railway lines from Germany to the front were under continuous Allied air interdiction. Fuel was being rationed at division level. Replacement drafts arriving from the Reich were increasingly drawn from training-shortened cohorts of younger and younger men, or from the disbanded divisions of other theaters, with skills that did not match the requirements of the Western Front. The ordnance repair system was still functional, but operating on German industrial output that had been under sustained bombardment for 2 years. Every link in the German chain was under pressure. Every link in the American chain was, if anything, becoming more robust as the supply lines from Normandy were supplemented by the opening of Antwerp in November 1944. This was not a contest between two similarly structured opponents in which one side happened to have more resources. It was a contest between two structurally different systems, one of which was designed for the kind of sustained, high-tempo, attrition-absorbing industrial war that the autumn of 1944 had become, and one of which had been designed for something faster, more decisive, and fundamentally less forgiving of long campaigns with no operational resolution in sight. The German army's response to what it was experiencing unfolded in several phases, And the record of that response is one of the more instructive documents of what happens when a sophisticated military institution encounters a structural problem it does not have the language to name correctly. The first phase was denial through alternative explanation. German intelligence assessments in the late summer and early autumn of 1944 consistently offered explanations for American reconstitution that did not require acknowledging the structural asymmetry. American units were misidentified. American unit designations were being used as deception. American commanders were rotating fresh units into positions while deceiving German observation about which formation was actually present. Some of these explanations were occasionally correct. American deception operations in the theater were real, and German intelligence was right to consider them. But the explanations were applied too broadly, because accepting the simpler explanation that American reconstitution was genuinely faster than German reconstitution required accepting a conclusion that German operational planning had no effective answer to. The second phase was tactical adjustment without strategic acknowledgement. German commanders on the Western Front began, in the autumn of 1944, to shorten the windows they allowed for counterattack after American units had been assessed as combat-ineffective. Post-engagement exploitation timelines were compressed. The implicit assumption shifted from "this unit is out for 2 weeks" to "this unit may be back on the line faster than expected." This adjustment was operationally rational and represents a genuine adaptation. But it was adaptation without understanding. The German commanders were responding to symptoms without having diagnosed the disease. The third phase, the one that produced the most revealing records, came after the war and the Foreign Military Studies program. Between 1945 and 1954, the U.S. Army Historical Division conducted a systematic program of interviewing former German officers and having them write analytical studies of their wartime experience. The collection, held at the National Archives and extensively used by American military historians, contains numerous passages in which former German commanders and staff officers describe their encounter with the American replacement and reconstitution system in terms that are striking for how long it took them to understand what they had actually been fighting. General Erich Brandenberger, commanding the 7th Army during the Autumn Campaign, is among those whose post-war accounts describe the operational disorientation produced by American reconstitution rates. Former German staff officers writing in the Foreign Military Studies series describe repeatedly encountering what they termed phantom reconstitution, units reappearing at combat strength in windows that violated their operational expectations, and being unable to determine whether they were observing genuine, rapid replacement or some form of American deception. The consistent pattern in these accounts is not that the German observers were slow or careless. The consistent pattern is that they were applying the wrong baseline. They were measuring American reconstitution against German reconstitution capability and concluding that the numbers were implausible, when in fact the numbers were accurately reflecting a system built to different specifications entirely. One post-war study in the Foreign Military Studies collection describes a German staff analysis conducted in the autumn of 1944 that attempted to calculate American replacement throughput from prisoner interrogations and captured documents. The analysis concluded that American replacement rates were being overstated in German intelligence reporting because the numbers, if accurate, implied a logistical infrastructure that the German analysts assessed as exceeding what they calculated the American supply system could support. The analysis was wrong. The numbers were accurate. The German analysts had underestimated the American logistical infrastructure because their reference point was the German logistical infrastructure of 1944, which was a shrinking system applied to an enormous commitment rather than an expanding system applied to a focused one. Keep something in mind as we move forward. The number that matters most in the story isn't a casualty count or a distance on a map. It's a timeline. How long it took for a broken unit to come back. Hold that question, because the next part of the story is where the machine shows you what that number actually cost. The machine worked. That is the historical conclusion, and it is not in serious dispute. What the machine did to the individual human beings who moved through it is a different question, and it is one that the official histories treat with considerably less attention than the logistical flowcharts deserve. The replacement soldier in the European theater of operations occupied one of the more psychologically exposed positions in the American Army. He arrived at his unit without relationship. He did not know the men he was assigned to fight beside. He had not been through the shared experience of training with this specific group, had not learned who the reliable men were through the informal social testing that combat units conduct continuously among themselves, had not built the kind of trust that research into small unit cohesion consistently identifies as the central determinant of combat effectiveness. He arrived as a number on a strength return, filling a slot that a dead man had vacated, and he was expected to be functional immediately. The men who received him were not always welcoming. Veterans in combat units learned early that replacements died at disproportionate rates. The replacement was a man who did not know the local terrain, did not know the specific habits and warning signs that the veterans of that sector had learned through direct experience, and did not have the automatic, tactical calibration that develops between men who have survived together. Veterans sometimes held new replacements at emotional distance as a self-protective measure, not out of cruelty, but because investing in a man who had a statistically elevated chance of being dead within his first week was a form of emotional expenditure that combat experienced soldiers could not always afford. This friction between the machine's throughput efficiency and the human reality of what that efficiency cost at the individual level was documented in American Army surveys conducted during the war, including the surveys organized by the research branch of the Information and Education Division, later analyzed by sociologist Samuel Stauffer and his colleagues in the landmark work, The American Soldier. The surveys showed consistently that replacement soldiers reported lower morale, higher anxiety, and greater uncertainty about their own performance than men who had been with their units for longer periods. The machine's answer to this problem was essentially to run faster, process more men through the pipeline more quickly so that the average replacement could become a veteran before the statistical risk window closed on him. The American infantry replacement's experience was not the machine's proudest product. The machine's proudest product was the operational fact that German commanders, looking at the front in September or October or November of 1944, could not calculate the effective combat power of American units with the confidence they needed for precise operational planning. That was real. The cost at the individual level was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and the interaction between them, a machine that worked strategically and was hard on people tactically, is a more accurate picture of the American replacement system than either the logistical triumph narrative or the humanist critique alone. The place where the machine was tested most severely, where its limits became most visible and its operational importance most demonstrable, was the Hurtgen forest. From September 1944 through February 1945, a series of American divisions ground through some of the most costly fighting in the European campaign inside a belt of dense, heavily mined, heavily fortified forest terrain east of Aachen, along the German-Belgian border. The Hurtgen was not a terrain choice that subsequent military analysts have judged favorably. The forest negated American advantages in air support and armor mobility, channeled American infantry into restricted avenues of approach under German observation, and created conditions in which German defensive positions in prepared bunkers and reinforced earthworks could be engaged effectively only at close range and at enormous cost. The casualties were severe by any measure. The 28th Infantry Division, engaged in the Hurtgen in November 1944, suffered losses of approximately 6,300 men in a single month of fighting, roughly equal to its authorized strength in infantrymen, and was effectively destroyed as a coherent fighting formation in that period. The 4th Infantry Division, which followed, suffered comparably. The 9th Infantry Division had been through the forest earlier in the autumn, with similarly catastrophic results. By the time the Hurtgen campaign ran its course, American divisions had rotated through the forest at intervals that made the engagement a sustained attrition exercise of the kind that American operational planning had not anticipated. And here the machine showed what it was. Each division that was destroyed or severely depleted in the Hurtgen was replaced. Not replaced in the sense of the division disappearing from the order of battle and a new formation taking its place. Replaced in the sense that the division's losses were absorbed by the replacement pipeline. The division was reconstituted around its surviving cadre and its headquarters structure, and it was returned to the line. The 28th Infantry Division, after its November catastrophe, was rebuilt and returned to operations. The process was not fast enough to prevent the unit's destruction as a coherent fighting force in the short term. The machine had limits, and the Hurtgen tested them. But the process was fast enough that the German Army's expectation of extended relief, of the American formations being removed from the operational equation for the weeks or months that German reconstitution of a comparable loss would have required, was not fulfilled. The German defenders of the Hurtgen did not face a single sustained attack and then a recovery period. They faced a continuous series of reconstituted attacks, one after another, from formations that were partially familiar and partially new, operationally battered and operationally reinforced simultaneously. The rate at which American divisions were worn down was real. The rate at which they were partially rebuilt and pushed back in was also real. The German defenders, who were themselves being consumed at a rate that their replacement system could not offset at comparable speed, were not winning a war of attrition in the Hurtgen, even when they were winning individual engagements. They were consuming American combat power at a rate that was slower than the rate at which American combat power was being regenerated. The machine was not unlimited. American commanders, including General Dwight Eisenhower, acknowledged after the war that the Hurtgen was a costly and arguable operational commitment. The replacement system was under genuine stress during the autumn of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge in December would reveal that stress in a direct and alarming way when the German offensive in the Ardennes caught American forces in a period of replacement system strain and created a short-term manpower crisis that required emergency measures to resolve. The machine had limits. The machine nearly showed those limits in a visible way in December 1944. But the operational payoff of the replacement machine was not primarily visible in any single engagement. It was visible in the arithmetic of the campaign as a whole. From the Normandy breakout in late July 1944 Through the crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, American forces in the European theater maintained a sustained operational tempo that German commanders consistently described post-war as something they had no framework for countering effectively. Not because American soldiers were individually braver. The German infantry in the autumn of 1944 was fighting with a ferocity and skill that American unit histories document with respect. Not because American tanks were individually superior. The Sherman's limitations against German armor were well understood and documented by American commanders and crews alike. But because the system behind the American soldier was not breaking down at the same rate as the system behind the German soldier. The pipeline was delivering. The strength returns were being met. The units were coming back. I think this is the part most people still get wrong when they talk about why the Western campaign went the way it did. The standard narrative puts it down to air power, or to numbers, or to the quality of the Sherman versus the Panzer, or to some version of American industrial output as an abstract. All of that is present. None of it explains the specific operational problem that German commanders were describing in their post-war accounts. The problem of units coming back. That problem was not about output in the abstract. It was about a system designed to convert output into operational continuity at a speed that German planning assumed was impossible. The numbers behind the American replacement machine in the European theater have a quality that takes a moment to process. Between June 6, 1944 and May 8, 1945, the period from D-Day to Germany's formal surrender, the U.S. Army in the European theater of operations processed in excess of 500,000 individual replacements through the replacement depot system. The total manpower of American forces in the theater peaked at approximately 1,500,000 men. American battle casualties in the European theater exceeded 550,000, of whom approximately 135,000 were killed in action. The replacement system absorbed losses at this scale, partially offset them at the theater level, and maintained American formations in continuous operational contact with the enemy from August 1944 through April 1945 without an extended operational pause. On the German side, the post-war analysis of Wehrmacht manpower statistics indicates that the German army on the Western Front was experiencing replacement deficits that were progressively widening from the summer of 1944 onward. German divisions that entered the Normandy campaign at authorized strength were, by the autumn, consistently operating at between 30 and 60% of their authorized manpower, with the deficit filled partially by replacement drafts and partially by accepting reduced effective strength as the operational baseline. By December 1944, when the German army launched the Ardennes offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein, the formations committed to that attack were in many cases operating at manpower levels that their own tables of organization classified as requiring reconstitution before commitment to major offensive operations. The German army launched its last major Western offensive with formations that its own doctrine said were not ready because the replacement system no longer had the throughput to make them ready. The contrast by that point was not primarily a question of courage or fighting quality. It was a question of what was in the pipeline. The irony is almost cruel. The German army, in December 1944, committed its best-preserved mechanized formations and its last significant fuel reserves to an offensive that was intended to create the conditions for a negotiated end to the war in the West, partly because German commanders had assessed that the American army was sufficiently weakened by the autumn's fighting to be vulnerable to a rapid penetration. The assessment was not entirely wrong. American formations were stretched, the replacement system was under strain, and the Ardennes sector was thinly held. But the offensive succeeded in its initial penetration, partly because the American system that was supposed to prevent it was already doing something else. It was actively rebuilding and re-equipping formations on other parts of the front, feeding men into units that would, within weeks, be the ones that drove to the Rhine. The German offensive was launched against a machine that was temporarily stressed but structurally intact. The machine absorbed the shock. The formations being rebuilt in November were fighting in February. You probably have your own verdict on this by now, about whether the replacement system's efficiency justified its human cost, or whether the Hurtgen was an operational choice that should have been made differently given what the machine could actually absorb. Those are real questions that historians have not fully resolved. Worth leaving in the comments if you've thought about it. The verdict on what gave the American Army its operational edge in the autumn and winter of 1944 is not a story that fits neatly on a thumbnail. It is not a single weapon, a single commander, a single battle, or a single tactical innovation. It is a system, quiet, administrative, built on forms and depots and trucks and repair schedules and classification sheets, sustained by an industrial base that was operating at a distance from the fighting that no previous industrial war had managed to achieve at comparable scale. German commanders in 1944 believed, in good faith and with professional competence, that they understood the rhythm of how armies wore down and recovered. They had 4 years of experience with that rhythm developed on fronts, where the armies on both sides were operating under broadly similar structural constraints. When they encountered an opponent operating under fundamentally different structural constraints shaped by an industrial base on a continent that had not been bombed, a manpower pool that had not been bled for 4 years, and a logistical architecture designed from the outset for sustaining a mass army at theater scale over an extended campaign, they tried to read that opponent through the lens of what they knew. The lens was wrong, not because they were careless, but because the opponent was not the same kind of thing they had been fighting. The form on the regimental S1's desk, the manifest at the replacement depot, the triage tag on the damaged Sherman at the ordnance collection point, the fuel allocation report at corps level. These were the instruments of the invisible advantage. They were not glamorous. They were not the kind of thing that gets carved into a war memorial. They were the things that made the battalion come back in 3 days instead of 3 weeks. They were the things that a German staff officer west of Aachen in September 1944 stared at through his field glasses and could not explain. The popular history of the Western Campaign of 1944 and 1945 has mostly settled on a version of the story that centers on battles, commanders, and weapons. That version is not wrong. It is incomplete. The record tells a different story alongside the famous one. The record contains the strength returns, the replacement depot manifests, the ordnance triage logs, the foreign military studies in which German officers described trying to calculate American reconstitution rates and arriving at numbers they believed were errors. The record contains the post-war studies of American replacement throughput that revealed a logistical machine operating at a scale and speed that the German army, by the autumn of 1944, had no structural capacity to match. The war in Western Europe in 1944 was decided by many things. It was decided by the courage of the men who went into the Hurtgen and came back and went in again. It was decided by commanders who made decisions under pressure that proved, on balance, to be sound. It was decided by air forces that made German daytime movement prohibitively costly and German supply increasingly strangled. It was decided by the opening of Antwerp and the Red Ball Express and the Normandy beaches. All of those things are true. It was also decided by a form, a unit strength return, a number on a page. The number of men present for duty, submitted by a battalion adjutant to regimental headquarters on a morning in late autumn. That was within 48 hours, being matched against available replacements moving forward from a corps-level depot. The German staff officer west of Aachen looked at the battalion that had come back in 3 days and could not explain it. He was right that it was something he had never seen before. He was wrong only in thinking that it was something exceptional. It was not exceptional. It was Tuesday. That is what the record says. And the record is more interesting than the myth.